Pota Williams.
Mr Chairman, let's look first at the primary legislation that this bill seeks to amend, and that's the, let me get this right, Social Security Act 1964. 1964, it's a long time since the primary legislation was enacted, and there have been many and significant changes to it over that time, and one would argue that in terms of its ability to continue to deliver the intent, that it may be time to be looking at it much more widely. Mr Chairman, I want to refer to some of the comments that the member Alfred Nuttall made about the numbers of children in hardship or the numbers of children in deprivation. However you slice it or dice it, you cannot get past the fact that there are 305,000 children living in poverty. And UNICEF, which Mr Nuttall did quote to the House, actually UNICEF on the very front page of their website quote that figure. So whether you're talking about hardship or poverty or deprivation or what you're talking about, you cannot get past the fact that we are talking about 305,000 children living in poverty. Are there more children who are deserving than those living in poverty? And this bill obviously is going some way to address some of those families, but we're talking about a small percentage of children who live with poverty every single day. That includes not being able to have their nutritional needs met, not being able to have their housing needs adequately met, probably not even able to have their educational needs met. That's a significant proportion of our future that is dealing and struggling with these issues every single day. So while Mr Nuttall might have a point about slicing and dicing the numbers, it doesn't go past the fact that we have hundreds of thousands of children who are living in poverty. When we look at this bill, and clause 10 actually gives us the provision for the $25 a week per family, and has already been said across this House that in actuality that probably amounts to about $23 in your hand. We are talking about $25 per family. The sizes of that family doesn't determine how much money you get. So if you are from a family of 3 or 4 or 5 children, you're looking at a couple of dollars each child per week extra, which is really, what, a loaf of bread, but not even probably a bottle of milk. So we're not talking about a huge amount. Now, don't get me wrong, Mr Chairman, I'm very, very happy that there are families that are going to get a little bit extra. But if we're actually going to deal with the issue of children in hardship, we should be making significant resource available to those families. And it shouldn't just be about money. It should be about, we all know that the educational level, or the level at which a mother's education reaches, has a significant impact on the well-being of and how well her children do. However, there is no provision within this to actually support parents, mothers to actually upskill and to utilise the time on a benefit to actually do further training to provide themselves with better skills, which actually at the end of the day probably would have more impact on the well-being of those children and those families. But I want to get back to the point of $25 or $23 in actuality to that family. When we're talking about some families, we're talking about beneficiary families tending not to be one-children families, 2, 3, 4 children families. So if we are looking at supporting those families better, those families in hardship better, why have we not looked at the recommendations from other experts in the field, which are ask us to consider amounts of around $60 to $80 to $100 per week for families, as opposed to the $25. Now, what will that do? That would make a significant difference, particularly if you were then requiring those beneficiary families to get out and get to work. It would make a significant difference, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
John O'Naylor.